Okay, everyone. Good evening and welcome very much to our Knowledge in Motion lecture presented by the Spalding New England Regional Spinal Cord Injury Model System. My name is Dr. Sherry Blauet. I serve as Director of Knowledge Translation and Dissemination for the model system. And we are very, very excited to host you this evening. Thank you very much for coming out on an already dark and sort of chilly fall evening. First, before we begin tonight's program, just a few housekeeping items. Please turn off your cell phones, of course, so that our speaker is not interrupted. The bathrooms, if you need them, are just this direction down the hallway towards the front door, about halfway down the hallway and to the right. During the question and answer period after Dr. Slocum's lecture, please just wait for someone to bring you the microphone because we are on a webcast, and everyone on the webcast will also want to hear your questions so they can hear the full discussion, and we'll have people walking around with roaming microphones when we get to the Q&A. If there's anything that you need during the lecture, for example, more water, napkins, any food, anything like that, please just wave your hands and we'll have one of our volunteers come to assist you so that you can easily get what you need. And finally, at the end of the lecture, please remember to fill out the survey that you received at check-in. And volunteers will also be available to assist with this if it would be helpful. So thank you again for joining us. We're very excited for this evening's program. In addition to this great audience that we have here on site, we also have webcast attendees from 22 states across the U.S. So hi to everyone online and thank you as well for joining. For this evening, we have a very special speaker, one of our own faculty members here at Spalding, and we're very, very proud to host. Dr. Slocum is currently an attending physician here at Spalding and an instructor in physical medicine and rehabilitation at Harvard Medical School. She received her doctoral degree from Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons and a Master of Public Health from the Harvard School of Public Health. She's board certified in physical medicine and rehabilitation as well as spinal cord injury medicine, and currently serves as a director of health policy for our department of PM&R here at Harvard, and Associate Director of Quality for Spalding Rehab Networks. So lots of accolades and titles for our speaker this morning. Her research interests focus on sacral function following spinal cord injury, public health, and access to quality care for persons with spinal cord injury, something that we know is, of course, very, very important. So Dr. Slocum is going to be talking about shaping the spinal cord injury research landscape, how consumers can make a difference. She'll explore historical perspectives on spinal cord injury research and examine how consumer feedback and input has really been integral into shaping our current landscape and how people can continue to get involved into the future. So without further ado, I'll welcome Dr. Slocum to the podium. And if you'll just give us one moment while we adjust the podium height. Dr. Slocum's a little taller than me, and then we'll be right with you.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Dr. Blauet, for that incredibly generous introduction. I'm really honored to be here with you guys tonight, and thank you, and welcome to everyone on our webcast as well. I'll be speaking about how consumers can shape the spinal cord injury research landscape, and giving, as Dr. Blauet said, some historical. Move it up. Okay. Is that better? How's this?
Much better.
Better. Okay. I think we can do this. I think I'm going to stick with this. Safe. So thank you, everybody, again, for being here with me tonight. I'm honored to be here with you all, and welcome to everyone on our webcast as well. My name is Slocum, and I'll be speaking on how consumers can shape the spinal cord injury research landscape and giving some historical perspectives, as Dr. Blauet mentioned. I have some disclosures. I've served as a health policy consultant, and I also have funding through the National Institutes of Health. In today's presentation, we'll go through the historical context of consumer perspective or consumer priorities for SCI research, the rise of consumer-informed research for spinal cord injury, or really research that is informed by consumer perspectives, methods by which consumers can inform the research priorities in spinal cord injury research currently, and then some perspectives on facilitators and barriers to participation in spinal cord injury research. Finally, we'll end up looking towards the future, looking at some current trends in spinal cord injury research and some factors that are important for consumers and researchers to consider. So starting out broadly, we should talk about who is a consumer. So when we talk about a consumer, we have to think of individuals, and broadly, individuals are consumers, but there's many different types. So when we think of spinal cord injury, we can think of users of services broadly, or anybody that is receiving services, whether it be care or non-care related otherwise, with a spinal cord injury. It can also be a caregiver, it can be a representative or an advocate, and it can be anyone in the public who may be a potential user of services. So that's really a broad definition. On top of individuals, there can be local groups as well as national and international consumer organizations. And these include bodies that are convened to give advice or to give input on priorities for consumers, not necessarily related to research, but it could also be related to policy. So these include population groups, support groups, groups that are specifically convened to discuss health matters, such as consumer panels or advisory boards, as well as philanthropic organizations and national and international support groups. So I thought I would bring up an example. This is a recent Times article about the Swiss domination of power wheelchair racing, something which may be familiar, and I was familiar with Dr. Blatt. This talked about the athletes themselves, as well as the people who support the athletes, coaches, as well as fundraising mechanisms through the Swiss Paraplegic Foundation. So when we go back to think about who is a consumer, we can see that all three of the groups represented here in the article are actually consumers in some perspective as related to advancing spinal cord injury research and advancing health for the spinal cord injury community. These include individuals with spinal cord injury, people who may be representatives or advocates for those individuals, as well as support groups and even fundraising bodies. So next I'll talk about the best estimates that we have of spinal cord injury in the United States, which come from two major sources. The first is the National Spinal Cord Injury Statistical Center, and the second is the Paralysis Research Center, both of which are funded by the Department of Health and Human Services and then the Administration of Community Living underneath that organization. The National Statistical Center estimates that there are somewhere between 1/4 to 500,000 people in the United States right now with a spinal cord injury. Their data comes from a national data set of approximately 32,000 people. The Paralysis Resource Center has different estimates. They conducted a random digit dial phone survey in 2013 that estimated that there are nearly 5.4 million people living with paralysis in the United States. Now they define paralysis broadly, and they included populations that do not have spinal cord injury, such as those with stroke, hemiplegia, those with cerebral palsy. But when we think about 5.4 million people with paralysis, that's a number of people collectively living in Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia. Huge numbers. When they broke it down into people with spinal cord injury, they estimated a much higher number than the estimates that come out of the National Statistical Center. And they actually estimated that as opposed to between 1/4 and 500,000 people living in the United States with spinal cord injury, there are nearly 1.4 million people living in the United States with spinal cord injury. And to put that into context, That's roughly the population of either San Antonio or Phoenix, Arizona. So again, a large number of people, and a large number of people to be served by potential research coming out about spinal cord injury. So now that we've talked about rough estimates of spinal cord injury in the United States, we should talk about the premier research institutions in the United States, namely the National Institutes of Health. And I'd like to talk about the National Institutes of Health and an initiative that came out in the early 2000s that really served as a catalyst for some of the consumer-informed research in spinal cord injury. And that is what's called the NIH Roadmap. The NIH Roadmap was conceptualized by then director Physiatrist, and it asked three major questions. The first was, what are the most pressing scientific challenges facing us today? The second was, what are the roadblocks to progress, and how can we overcome these barriers? And the third was important because the National Institutes of Health is made up of 27 different institutes and centers, and the roadmap really aimed to look at cross-institute priorities, or priorities that really were not just the domain of one institution or a couple of centers, but were really the responsibility of the National Institutes of Health as a whole. And so within this environment, researchers in the United States began to ask, what are the priorities for spinal cord injury research? This is a schematic that shows what the goals were for the NIH roadmap, which was really to open the playing field and to broaden some of the priorities for the NIH, as well as to decrease the amount of time and accelerate progress and how it can be applied to consumers. So how do we apply this to spinal cord injury? So in 2004, Anderson colleagues put out a survey of consumers with spinal cord injury. And this was important because, as Anderson said, biomedical researchers were, and still are rightly so, focused very much on an all-encompassing cure for paralysis. The issue that Anderson brought up is that if all biomedical research is focused on a cure for paralysis, then there are a number of key clinically important areas that are not being addressed that represent areas where incremental change could make a substantial difference in quality of life for people with spinal cord injury. And that research in those areas can occur without detriment to continuing research that focuses on a cure for paralysis. And so Anderson asked about spinal cord injury, she asked about demographics, and she asked about things like arm and hand function, upper body strength, trunk balance, bowel and bladder function, as well as autonomic dysreflexia, sexual function, as well as chronic pain, normal sensation, as well as walking movement. Finally, she asked about whether or not consumers thought that exercise rehabilitation was an important aspect of regaining function, and whether or not consumers had any access to exercise rehabilitation currently. She found that the highest priority for individuals with tetraplegia or persons who have paralysis of all four limbs was arm and hand function, followed by sexual function, trunk stability, bowel and bladder function, and elimination of autonomic dysreflexia, as well as walking movement, normal sensation, and chronic pain. Elimination of chronic pain, I'm sorry. The highest priorities for individuals with paraplegia were improvement in sexual function, bowel and bladder function, as well as elimination of autonomic dysreflexia, trunk stability, walking movement, chronic pain, normal sensation, and then arm and hand function. When consumers were asked about their access to exercise rehabilitation and their thoughts on how important it was, over 96% of consumers thought that exercise rehabilitation was important to their health, or access to exercise once they had returned home from the hospital. As compared to that number, which is nearly 100%, less than 60% of people actually had access to exercise rehabilitation once returning home. And of those, only roughly 12% had access to exercise rehabilitation with a trained therapist. So moving on from Anderson's research, there was a growth in what we could call consumer-informed research for spinal cord injury, or research that incorporated these perspectives, these clinically important areas that were not just about an all-encompassing cure for paralysis, but represented incremental progress in several domains as we continue to work on research that supports a cure. And of these, in the health domain, researchers found again and again that motor function, including arm and hand function, mobility, bowel and bladder function, and sexual function were all very important to consumers, as well as access to exercise. When more detailed research was done on exercise participation and access to exercise, researchers found that there were important differences between consumers who self-identified as exercisers and who self-identified as not exercising. Those included being able to have an accessible fitness center in one's area, whether or not a person felt welcome to join a typical fitness center that was not specifically designed for a person with disability, and issues related both to transportation as well as payment or fitness center dues. So not only access, but affordability was also important to consumers in these. So as we think about why consumer-informed research is important, it's not just that the collaboration with the community, consultation with people who are actually affected by a specific condition of interest, and consumer control of the research. It's because the research, involvement in the research process increases empowerment of consumers in the process, and it also makes sure that any findings from the research have the greatest impact and are most meaningful to that population. So now I'm going to talk about how do we bridge that human gap. So we know that it's important to involve consumers in research. How do we do that? How do we make something that we know is important, in fact, into something actionable? Next, I'm going to talk about opportunities to shape the spinal cord injury research landscape. And is that feedback from me? Sorry. All right, I'm going to keep going. So I'm going to talk about opportunities to shape the research landscape. And I'll walk you through this process, but this is a general process. It can apply to basic science research. It can apply to programmatic research. It can apply to essentially any sort of research plan that you might imagine or hypothetical question you could come up with. The first 7 or so steps of this involve closer collaboration with a specific research team. And the last 2 don't require such close collaboration, but they're still critical. So regardless of how you can see yourself getting involved in research or how you can see yourself contributing to dialogues around spinal cord injury research, no matter where you participate in this process, it's important. So the first is to develop the study concept, whatever the scientific question is you're investigating. Securing funding is often important for research questions. Preparing the study protocol, creating study procedures, actual implementation of whatever question you're investigating, monitoring, analyzing and interpreting the results, and then disseminating information about the study and actually reviewing what the study means and implementing any actionable goals that come out of your findings. So when we think about developing the study concept, so any question you can think of, whether it relates to walking movement, access to exercise, injuries that may be common, Paralympic sports, it's important to involve consumers so that they can provide information on unmet needs, as well as the treatment and disease burdens, and then what matters most to patients and consumers. Because if you have a research question and you don't know what matters most, it pretty much guarantees that whatever findings you have from that will not be as impactful as if you had involved consumers at the beginning and found out the answers to those questions. If you are so called to, you can work with a researcher or a research team to secure funding. These are some common federal funding initiatives with the National Institutes of Health, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, and Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. And I'm really proud to say that different researchers in Boston, including Dr. Lisa Iazzoni over at MGH, have research funding from some of these institutions. There's also novel research and development funding models. There are private-public partnerships, and then securing one's own funding. So there are also different funding models related to calls for research, development of a specific technology or a specific tool that may have other funding streams and may be offered by industry. Throughout the research process, it's important to, when creating the study procedure, have consumer input on study design, including barriers to participation, study endpoints, and risk-benefit perceptions. So this is just, a gut test of whether or not the research question makes sense, whether or not it's acceptable to the community of consumers, and then barriers to participation, which are especially important when we think about communication and accessibility for some populations. It's also important if you're a consumer, you're involved to help with eligibility criteria in the study protocol, whether or not they make sense. These are all opportunities where consumer input are important for researchers. Consumer input can also be useful to advise study recruitment strategies and patient education materials. From the study from Anderson at the beginning that we talked about, she advertised for her survey because she wanted input from consumers with spinal cord injury. And this was before the onset of SurveyMonkey and large internet surveys, but she advertised in New Mobility and in 360 Mag, and she sent mailer surveys. So it's important to understand from consumers also what are the appropriate recruitment strategies and education strategies that we can help to make sure that we have as much participation as possible so that our research is meaningful. In the process of study monitoring, it's important to help educate and motivate, as well as recruit people with SCI for SCI research, sometimes referred to as patients in the research process, but with more person-centered language, we tend to prefer persons with SCI. And it's also helpful to help design informed consent process and documents so that when someone is signing up for research, they know what's involved. And we will get to how that's important as well. Later, we talk about facilitators and barriers for research participation. For certain studies and for certain trials, there's a required data safety monitoring board, which is essentially a board that is required for the study and is made up of people who monitor both the safety of the subjects who are involved in research, as well as the validity and the integrity of the study data. This can include a consumer advocate or a community representative that does not necessarily have specific training in research or a scientific background, but is a consumer perspective that is there on the safety monitoring board to make sure that consumer perspectives are represented as safety and data validity information are being reviewed. And it's also important to provide recommendations for revising a study protocol if changes need to be made at any point when you're monitoring the study. So these last two steps are important because they do not require such a close relationship with a specific research team. But input into these in these places is equally as important, if not equally critical. Consumers can provide feedback to researchers and research teams on how the patient community will view the results of their findings. And consumers can also work with the research team to ensure that study participants get meaningful feedback from the study, which is important and is one of the factors known to be a facilitator for participation in research. So whether or not someone is actually getting meaningful data or meaningful results back from the study as opposed to just participating in something and then not hearing back about it until something is published quite later. Consumers can write newsletter articles. Consumers can also disseminate information about results from studies. And in some conferences, consumers also co-present results with researchers at a conference or support groups. Some of these may seem far away from any particular individual experience, but it's important to keep in mind that consumers can become involved through different community groups. So individual consumers, if they are involved with groups like United Spinal or a specific coalition within a community, may be able to receive information on serving on advisory committees or boards, as well as providing public testimony and being involved in post-market surveillance materials. So now that we've talked about all of the ways that you can get involved and can participate in the research design process, we're going to talk about why people might want to become involved as a research participant. And this comes from data also by Anderson and colleagues on over 800 people internationally, with a heavy sampling from the United States and Canada, but from consumers with spinal cord injury across the globe. Factors that are known to be universal facilitators for participation in spinal cord injury include possible improvement in functionality, as well as opportunities, including learning about health, helping future people who have spinal cord injury, and recommendations. So most strongly, actually, a recommendation from another person with a spinal cord injury has been found to be an important facilitator for participation in research. Universal barriers include concerns about possible decline in functionality following research participation, as well as possible side effects of research, out-of-pocket expenses, and concerns about losing medical coverage. Neutral factors included religious and privacy issues, as well as experience with previous clinical trials. And divided factors, which were not strong facilitators and also not strong barriers, included not knowing whether or not the condition would improve, knowledge about clinical trials, and possible impacts on family, friends, and personal care attendants, as well as work and family obligations. And these differed sometimes depending on country of origin or geographic area, but were not strongly a facilitator nor a barrier. So I hope by now that I have talked at some length about how you can participate in research, some of the ways that you could get involved, and hopefully you feel more comfortable about how you might be able to shape the research process, not just by participating in research as a subject or as a participant of a specific study, but actually having your voice heard and being able to give input on how a study is designed or what its goals are. I think from my perspective, and I'd be eager to hear yours during the question and answer session, there are three main things that come out to me that are critical as we move forward in spinal cord injury research. One is that consumer-informed research, or research that really takes consumer perspectives into account, is critical as we move forward. The next is that consumers need to understand and have access and really have knowledge about how to get involved in the research process, not just as a participant, but as someone who helps design research and offer community perspectives in the design of research. And the third is that researchers need to understand what the common barriers and facilitators are for people with spinal cord injury to actually participate in research. Because if we don't have that, then we will not have research that is as impactful and as meaningful as it could be. These include the priorities that we discussed, and they also include things that we know are important, but where we know there's a gap. So things like access to exercise, things like access to exercise, not just within a facility that's designed a certain way, but how welcoming it is and how available it is to people, and issues that relate to transportation and affordability as well. Another important thing to consider as we think about the research landscape in the coming years are an increasing number of requirements for researchers to share data and to actually share their findings and their basic data that they're collecting with other researchers. So while the culture still has a ways to go, like I said, there are increasing number of requirements. And in this paper from just last year, researchers were polled, and some of the preeminent researchers on spinal cord injury in the United States were asked about their incentives for sharing data across researchers in the US. And they seem to realize with this that there are significant advantages to the research community having that data be available, including enhancing scientific reproducibility, or reproducing a study or a case study or a surgical procedure or designing a piece of equipment at another site by another person and being able to reproduce it and potentially improve upon it, as well as enhancing the opportunity for scientific discovery. So when we share data and we share ideas, our opportunity to grow and sort of expound upon the ideas that are present in the research community can only increase. So by now, I hope that I've convinced you that advancing consumer participation across the research continuum is both an ethical and a scientific imperative if we're going to increase knowledge, and that involving consumers from bench to bedside to practice is a necessity. I'd like to challenge all of you when you think about sort of where we've come from in the research environment and where we're going in the research environment. If you don't see your perspectives or your priorities represented here, to get involved. So to get involved at any of the points along the continuum, to reach out to your community organization, to reach out to researchers here at Spalding, nationally, potentially internationally, and make your perspectives heard. And to cap it off, I wanted to remind you that Elias Zerhoni, the gentleman who is the previous head of the NIH, had sort of a famous saying as he was unrolling the NIH roadmap, and that is that there is no wrong time to do the right thing. So if you've not been involved, or if the progress we've made so far has been frustrating or it seems slow to you, there's no wrong time to do the right thing. And I think researchers in the US, here in Spalding, and across the globe would welcome your perspectives. And I think with that, I'm going to take questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Slocum. So now we'll start into some Q&A, and just a reminder, please raise your hand, and one of our staff will come to you with a microphone so that everyone on the webcast can also hear your question. So I think we have Sir in the front. Did you have a question? Yep.
I'm going to be reading the question back to you. If that sounds a little weird, it's for the webcast.
Well, I have a couple of comments that I would make. To me, I would lose insurance companies and providers as consumers, because most of us get it paid for by them, and if they're not willing to pay for it, doesn't really spend it. And distance is a big barrier. You didn't really mention that. I mean, I know I'm trying to get on every list I can for participation in studies. Mm-hmm. And UIME has all sorts of studies that look really cool, but I look pretty hard in, but they require I have to show up at the doorstep. So if they can have some way of distributing participation more readily, and I don't know what would be barriers from that side of it. It would seem like if you've got a hospital here, you've got a hospital there, they probably have the same machines, so why can't they do the same tests? So that would be something that might be useful too.
So I think those are both excellent points. Just for the purposes of the webcast, I'm going to try to recap. And for anybody, and for you in the future, if I recap something and I leave something that you said out, please call me on it. So I think what you were saying is that insurance companies should be consumers as well, because they are consumers of services in a sense, that services go through them and sometimes have to be approved by them. And so they should also be listed as a consumer. The other point that you made was that distance to the study site can be a big barrier to participation in research. And I think that Anderson and colleagues did find that. They found that time commitment was also an issue. But I think that, to your point, it is difficult to participate in something that is not available, just as it's difficult to have access to exercise if something is not immediately geographically available. And I think that is one of the other aims of trying to make data and research design more accessible through data sharing networks. In that if you had a project at a particular institution that was not as readily available near you, then a research team could ostensibly take that up, or could look at how feasible it might be to reproduce that at another geographic site, therefore expanding access to research participation.
I'd also say too, I can add as
Go
well
ahead.
that that's part of the benefit of things like model systems, because it does enable us to, as a network of institutions that work in the area of spinal cord injury across the country, to collaborate more easily for research ideas to be proposed that then other centers can jump on board with, so that there may be multiple sites that are all working on the same study. So some of that does happen, but of course it'd be great to see even more of it into the future, and when it does happen, it's great on a number of accounts. You know, it's easier to participate for consumers. You also get perspectives of consumers from different regions of the country. And those consumers may have different perspectives, right? Because we're all different from where we're from.
You've got more participants.
That's right.
That's
Yeah,
right.
It's very win-win. And a lot of things are heading that way, and we always want to see more collaboration with that exactly. All right. I think we had a
We have
question
some
from-
questions on the
from
webcast. Yes, Diana.
Thank you. So we have a question that came in. How do you suggest to build a framework for researchers and funders to involve the clinical and plex, people with lived experience, communities, while avoiding tokenism? For example, using 1 or 2 people to represent the entire SCI community.
So that's an excellent question. Do I need to repeat that into this mic, or are we good? We're good.
Everyone in the webcast can see it.
Got it. So I think that's an excellent question, and I think the one of representation is complex. I think that to Dr. Blau's earlier point, more collaboration is better, and I think that, for instance, data safety monitoring boards that require consumer participation, the more we encourage and the more opportunities we create, I think that there is less opportunity for tokenism, because I think that we can only win when we create more opportunities for consumers to get involved and more opportunities for consumer input. And that's why I think things like offering public testimony or submitting public feedback, for instance, the National Institutes of Health right now has a call for public comments on the blueprint for neurological science going forward and informing that. And so submitting things through that for public comment, and if we can get more of a range of people involved, then I think that that is certainly one way to guard against things like tokenism. And okay.
Sorry, Dr. Slocum, should have the point, or should we?
No. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm trying to figure out if one way you could reach the consumer is giving more information to the medical doctor, say here, Spalding, as well as the primary care doctors, so that if there are particular concerns, I've had concerns with my care, and I have basically been dismissed, and it is what it is. And I don't think some of the research is really taking in, as the person before me said, the different groups of people, because no matter who you are, if you have SCI, everyone presents differently and everyone has different reactions to different things. So you can't take the whole group and just say, well, this 2 or 3 people. You need to have a wide span of people. Why isn't that information and reach out to different people from different groups and classes that all have SCI, but present differently? Why isn't that? Why aren't we reaching out to the entire population and getting a sample from each particular group?
So I think that's a great question. I'm going to paraphrase, and then you can give me a thumbs up, or you can let me know if I bombed it. So it sounds like you're asking that why, a couple of things. Why doesn't research get translated down to doctors, not just SCI doctors, but primary care physicians? And why aren't research findings adopted by them? And then also, why maybe research doesn't embrace the full breadth of the spinal cord injury community and the way that things may present for one person with spinal cord injury and not for another person. And the way that those two things are experienced but may also medically present for somebody, and how we can incorporate those perspectives. Not just into research, but it sounds like you're also asking how can we do that in a diligent way in clinical care?
Yes.
Kind of.
I guess what I'm also saying is that if the doctors know that different people are having different issues, and research can, if they can be a part of a study, see how that can work. Say versus I'm an incomplete versus a complete.
Yes.
And the different things that I experience versus someone who is complete. But we are not given that information through the researchers. It's not trickling down to the doctors who sees the patients, the consumers, to give us the opportunity to
participate. So this is also an important question, which is how are everyday clinicians aware of research participation and opportunities to participate so that people who present for clinical care can be involved in research? And I think that's an important question. I think it's something that we work on, I know here at Spalding quite intensively, and it's something that I think depends on the structure of how clinicians work, the clinic structure where they work, potentially the hospital system where they work, and the research enterprise itself as well. So I know there's been recent work, for instance, in the cancer population for people who are seen in community hospitals, which traditionally have not been clinical trial sites. But there, I think, is a growing realization by health systems that if they're going to have as much representation as possible, and they're going to have recruitment for studies and the best participation rates possible, then it behooves them to collaborate across institutions and make this information more readily available, I think.
There's also some resources just to make everybody aware too, with regards to the translating aspect, which I think part of your question touched upon too. There are some pretty great resources. For example, the Knowledge Translation Center for the Spinal Cord Injury Model Systems is a website that anyone should be able to access as long as you have a computer and Wi-Fi or even on your phone. And they have, for example, things called fact sheets that tackle, high sort of hot topics in spinal cord injury and really distill down and consolidate the research into like what a consumer should know. So things like, adaptive sports and recreation, or skin, and things like pressure sores and management of pressure sores. yeah, and a number of other ones. And so that's also great, sort of one-stop shopping or a quick way to find a lot of good information. And they also do quick translations of studies, so studies that have just come out that are sort of hot off the press, and translating that into language that would be friendly for consumers to understand, okay, here's a new study, what did it show, what is sort of the more groundbreaking and sort of front-end research. So that's a great website as well where people can definitely find more information.
Yes. And also affiliated but not part of the model systems, if you are interested in getting involved in a study that is still actively recruiting, the Spinal Cord Outcomes Partnership Endeavor, which is a collaboration that developed, has a list that they put out that is sort of well formatted, that is a PDF that's easy to read, of all the active spinal cord injury clinical trials that are out, and updated every 3 months. You don't have to click through 80 different websites on clinicaltrials.gov, and that's also a great resource. Diana? Yes.
You. Another question is, you mentioned that a barrier is a consumer's understanding of the research process. Do you have a suggestion to other models that have educated the consumer community about the research process?
I think there are some great resources. I think, unfortunately, as a theme that's coming up here, we don't do a universally good job necessarily across the research community of having enough consumer-oriented resources to educate about the research process. But I think that there's some great information by, for instance, Kim Anderson. We have information here. The model system staff is highly collaborative, and I know work across with United Spinal as well as the model systems. I'm sure that all of our researchers would be happy to talk with consumers here physically, and then for folks on the webcast, I think being educated about the research process may also be specific for a specific clinical trial, and every clinical trial should have a coordinator or somebody who will be able to field questions about the research. And sometimes while those people may seem very distant, if you're interested in a particular study, they can be quite accessible and send information on what a specific trial would involve, and what may be different facilitators or barriers based on the specific research. Jenny.
I apologize if we've already answered this question directly, but the partners in general have a more proactive system where they seek out just members under their veil to participate in any sort of study that they have going on. I know this office itself has a system of people that they constantly reach out to for different studies, but I'm just talking about the partner system in general.
The partner system does have a clinical trials research board and a newsletter that gets emailed out for different trials. I know that the partner system itself also advertises widely on, for instance, the MBTA, and has other methods of communicating different trials that are potential for research participants. So certainly something like the MBTA is quite universal and is not targeted at a specific audience. But I think that probably the internal newsletters do reach not just spinal cord injury physicians, but not just physicians, but providers who will be working with people with spinal cord injury in many different settings. Yeah, thank you.
Did you raise your hand yet?
Yeah.
Hi, I just wanted to point out, I'm with United Spinal Association, and we do have a compilation of resources for people who are interested in learning about the process of what it means to be involved in research, different websites we can learn about information about what it is to participate in patient support on the resource section.
Yes. So that was just an excellent point. The United Spinal itself, the national organization, besides talking to people here in the local chapter, the national organization has resources that are available online that are accessible to find out more about the research process, and can also answer some questions about that. Diana.
Thank you. I have another question that came up before I left while I was at Cape Ward. Someone wanted to know exactly where they can find out information about studies they participated in years ago. And with this gentleman, it was a model system study, so it was easy for me to point him in the right direction. But we're hoping that you can speak a little bit about that on a national and international level.
So on a national and international level, I would say the studies that are, for instance, part of the Spinal Cord Outcomes Partnership Endeavor database are all indexed. So they have a national clinical trial identifier, and they have a designated team. And along with that national clinical trial identifier, there's an email contact, and there's a phone number, and there's an institution. So if you participated in a clinical study, that I know there are currently people who are in a trial and they have data that's collected on them, and that's your health data. But as a research subject, unless the research institution that you were collaborating with or participating with is sort of wiped off the face of the planet, then there should be a way to get back to that institution. So whether or not that's through the National Clinical Trial Identifier, or the email or the phone number that's listed, or finding out what the research enterprise is now. So even, for instance, if a site no longer has a model system, if you were a model system participant, then one option would be to go to the National Spinal Cord Injury Statistical Center or the model center, the model systems headquarters, and ask them how you would get in touch with whoever is the steward for that data. That's a great question. Are there other burning questions?
What's that?
Sure.
I would say the two things. I personally have a non-traumatic injury, and I try to keep track of what's going on in the research. My girlfriend, who used to work in the medical library when she was in college, she speaks a little bit than I do, tracks it. And I see all sorts of research being done on traumatic injury, which is big, we've got one. But you try finding research on ischemic injury, and you find that they doctors put me in the chair, and they're not doing damn thing out. And the other thing is, it's really great that they're helping lab rats learn how to walk, recover motion and function and so on. But where can people who are willing volunteers, knowing that it's a high-risk thing, participate in human trials? Because if you're not doing it to people, I'm sorry, it's vapor. And I realize there's concerns about safety and consent and all of that, but some of us are willing to roll the dice and take a chance to, hopefully get something out of it instead of continuing the way we are. And that seems to be an opportunity that's denied to us.
So I think you bring up some good questions, some good points, really. I think there is a dearth of research on non-traumatic injuries. And I think that at least we know from the demographic trends with the model systems and more broadly in the United States that the prevalence of non-traumatic injuries is increasing as a total share of the spinal cord injury population. Historically, the model systems have focused mostly on traumatic injuries. However, that is both good and not good. I mean, we want to prevent injury, whether it be traumatic or non-traumatic. But I think that the increasing prevalence of non-traumatic injuries means that there will be increased consumer participation, there will be increased feedback, that there need to be breakthroughs in this area as well. And as for participation in novel but potentially risky research, I think I would have to say that would depend on the research team that you're working with in terms of whether or not they have a study that they would be willing to have any humans participate in, and that brings up issues with human subjects research. And so I think all researchers want things to be safe and want there to be a risk-benefit ratio that is acceptable, as in not having unduly high risks for people that participate, since one of the major barriers is a potential decline in function, and so often that is done through animal models. And so unfortunately, there can be really exciting animal research and understanding that rats are not the same as humans. And while we have a lot of research on rats with spinal cord injury models, that a rat spinal cord is also not a human spinal cord, and that translating this research into important, groundbreaking human trials is something that I think the whole field would like to accelerate.
I just feel like they're kind of sort of playing too much God playing of, we're making the decision for you, that you are not allowed to make your own judgment as to how and say, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's part of the context of research now in 2018 and really over the last several years that the threshold for getting studies approved in humans and people is very high in terms of safety. And so it's very difficult for researchers, even very high level researchers, to come up with study designs and have them approved if they're extremely risky or have the potential to be really unsafe. But that is really part of the larger research context. It's not reserved just as an issue in spinal cord injury research. And obviously, at the end of the day, there's always a balance between, wanting to think about protocols and study designs that can really prove fruitful and provide interesting and potentially groundbreaking information, but also ensuring that no harm is done along the way, or at least undue harm. And so it's something that affects research, is kind of a principle these days in research across the board. You think about even things like cancer trials, for example, and trialing different medications. And if it's a risky medication, then it's going to be, of course, much more difficult to get research approved and certain protocols approved. I'd also like to say something that I was going to say at the end, but we can say now, which is there's two groups here this evening that have more information regarding their own work, and one of them is our Inspire Lab that's here at Spalding that does do work in individuals and humans related to neural recovery. And so if you have any questions about that or are interested, there's information in the back of the registration. So there's some going on here as well.
I'd also like to add that if you think of something, right, there's no, I don't like to say there's no idea that's too wild or outlandish. I think if you can dream it, we can think of a way that we could possibly do that. And as Dr. Blauett said, I think the sort of horizon constraining that is usually safety. But if you look at a lot of, some key studies or some key things that have been implemented in humans, for instance, the trials that just came out on stimulation, then those involve close collaboration with a specific consumer and a specific researcher. And I wish that I could post something up with a phone number for your closest researcher. But that is another reason to get to know the spinal cord injury research team that is available around you, either locally or to get in touch, virtually with spinal cord injury researchers that may be, in the U.S. or even internationally, and to ask what they're doing, and to ask where they are in their work, and if they have anything novel that they're working on that they would be willing to talk to you about.
One more? All right, we have another question.
What's one of the most popular research studies out there, and where are most research studies, located, and basic time frame? How long do they usually last?
So it really depends, and that's also a great question. So in terms of what is research in spinal cord injury and what's most common, I would say it really ranges. So the model systems here is based in research, and we collect a national database that's been going since 1975, and we have people who have been in it for 40 years. So that's sort of one extreme. There's also a researcher, Jim Krause in South Carolina, who studies what he calls extreme longevity in the spinal cord injury population. He has people that he's been following for beyond 40 years since injury. There are trials that look at drug delivery for medications within 72 hours after a spinal cord injury, and can be something that is really that tight and that close. So they really range. Studies can be focused on people within the first year after injury. They can also be focused on subacute or chronic injury for longer periods afterwards. And so it depends on the specific research question. I would say that it ranges whether or not you're talking about drug delivery trials, you're talking about things like stem cell or implantable stimulator trials, and it also ranges for rehabilitation technology trials. So depending on the question, it can be very focused, it can be focused on new injuries, or it can be focused on injuries that are later. As our
Time is now 7:30 p.m. and visiting hours will be over in half an hour.
As our audience member,
Time is now 7:30 p.m. and visiting hours will be over in half an hour.
Very astutely brought up. The studies, I would say, do tend to be weighted more to the drug and stem cell trials do tend to be weighted towards traumatic injury, and part of that has to do with keeping trial numbers small initially to see a significant finding before things are translated into something that's more accessible. But for instance, rehabilitation technology trials, looking at, for instance, technology, equipment, even potentially implantable technology, may have a broader definition of who they're looking for as a research participant. Yes. I'm glad we have a lot of time for questions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if there has been much emphasis on the mental health aspects of traumatic spinal cord research.
That is a great question. So I think that within the model systems, we have what are called modular projects where centers collaborate across the United States with other model systems. I think a significant component of the research portfolio for that organization does have to do with quality of life broadly, which includes health and well-being, mental health. I think that the other source of information for research on mental health aspects of spinal cord injury also comes from our colleagues at the Veterans Administration. And they have another system of care that is not the model systems, as you would see it sort of writ at Spalding, but also tracks people who have a spinal cord injury and keeps them within a system of care where mental health is sort of one ongoing thing that is evaluated and assessed and tracked. And so I would say those are probably the two biggest sources of research.
I have another question about, will you talk a little bit about the difference in importance between medical or clinical research and quality of life studies and their requirements?
Sure. So medical or clinical research, and I would say that quality of life is sometimes lumped into the medical or clinical bucket because quality of life is something that is clinically quite important and something that at least I, as a spinal cord injury physician, care passionately about. I think that quality of life studies often focus on perceptions of satisfaction. So they focus on how satisfied people are with certain aspects of their life, whether or not it can be their relationships, their health. We're experiencing some technical complications. Thank you all for sticking with us. So I think quality of life research tends to focus on concepts that are measured through surveys, not necessarily surveys like we talked about in terms of what functions are most important to you, but surveys that relate to your health, your well-being, and sort of your subjective sense of well-being in your environment. And those can often be specific and influenced by a lot of different factors that are not necessarily under individual control, but when we think about access to transportation and income, and we do know that there is some variability with quality of life just in terms of where you're living. So if you think about if you're living in a country that is affected by a civil war versus if you're living in a highly developed country that has a high standard of living, then that might affect your quality of life responses on a particular survey. Medical and clinical research is a huge basket, but includes things like biomedical research into, for instance, tissue scaffolds, in terms of the biology of spinal cord injury and the biology and neurobiology of repair and nerve regeneration. And it also has to do with clinical studies that relate to, how can we best manage bladder complications in people who have a spinal cord injury? How can we best manage musculoskeletal complications, right? Dr. Bauer does research on musculoskeletal health and also injury prevalence in elite Paralympic athletes. So that is an example of clinical research as well. And I think that quality of life research is one example of clinical research, but it is a specific focus of that.
Okay, we have time for a few more. Thank you everyone for working on the surveys as well. It's really valuable feedback and we do use it when we think about planning future lectures. So we appreciate that.
Thank you.
Okay, so sensing that, I think we'll wrap up the formal program. Dr. Slocum will be here, I'm sure, for individual questions for anyone who may think of something in the next few minutes or would like to speak one-on-one. And just a few closing remarks. We thank everyone for joining us here in Boston and also via the webcast, for those who are tuning in online. Again, please remember to fill out the survey and thank you for those who are doing so now. And again, our volunteers if you need any assistance with that. Again, I'll remind you to please, if you're interested in research participation, we do have information regarding a couple of studies this evening with more information in the back. So if you are interested in even learning more about the protocols, what might be involved, what kind of research it is, please stop at the desk. We'll be happy to answer those questions. And please note that we have a little bit of extra food. So if you'd like to take some food with you, we don't want it to go to waste. Please head over to the table and we will be happy to help you package them up. So thank you again for joining this evening. We'll be back in 2019 for additional PIM lectures. The agenda is currently being developed, but we're sure to have some exciting patient speakers coming up in the coming year. We really appreciate everyone venturing out. We know it's not easy and there's a lot of traffic here in Boston in the evenings. So we appreciate your brave journey through that in order to get here to join us. So thank you again. Safe journeys home, and we appreciate